welcome everybody officially to our panel on civilian harm. My name is Paul Williams. I'm a professor here at the Elliott School, where I help run our Masters in Security Policy Studies. Now, thinking back a long time ago, my PhD supervisor used to tell me on a regular basis that if you're going to study anything, it should be something important. And I can't think of many more important topics in world politics than studying civilian harm and how to go about reducing it. So we're very pleased to welcome the PAX team, or some of the PAX team, to talk about their new book on civilian harm and how they conduct some of this difficult work to investigate violence against civilians in the field, in the world's war zones. Now, of course, the fact that they're all very busy people, I think, tells its own very depressing story. We know there's a good raft, of course, of international laws and norms that are supposed to help distinguish combatants from non-combatants and to protect civilians from deliberate harm during warfare. But of course, in recent years, the signs have been rather depressing, I think, that a lot of these laws and norms are being consistently ignored, or worse, they're being abused. Just to take one example, in 2008, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program registered 21 ongoing campaigns of lethal one-sided violence against civilians around the world. And that was the lowest number they'd recorded since their data began back in 1989. But since 2008, sadly, that number has nearly doubled. And if you look at their data, most recent data for now 2020, they're cataloguing 41 campaigns of one-sided violence. The most deadly in 2020, of course, being mainly in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, across the Sahel, also the Lake Chad Basin area in Ethiopia, northern Mozambique, and then outside Africa, of course, in Afghanistan, major problems there as well. So to help us understand some of the complexities and key characteristics involved in this rather depressing context, as I said, we're very pleased to welcome some of the PAX team to talk about their new book on civilian harm. This was published in June last year. And as I put the link in the chat, it's freely available for you online. And I highly recommend you checking it out in further detail. Now, what we're going to do in terms of how the panel will run, we've already provided you with the main biographies of our participants, but just to quickly give you a sense of the order and an overview, we're going to start off with one of the book's authors, that's Erin Bell, who will talk about the gulf in civilian harm between how militaries tend to view it in terms of short-term planning and execution, compared to how local communities often experience harm as a much more long-term phenomenon and multifaceted phenomenon. And Erin is the project officer in the PAX Protection of Civilians team, where she focuses on tracking, investigating and responding to civilian harm issues, as well as doing international advocacy around those same issues. And then following Erin, we'll turn to Mark Galasco. Mark's going to remind us about some of the key relevant issues of international humanitarian law and the roles that different organizations play in investigating civilian deaths and harm. And he's going to walk us through a case study from Syria's war, which includes some of the sort of accountability mechanisms that are being now obviously tried out for some of Syria's war criminals. Now, Mark, we're pleased to say, is a distinguished Elliott School alum, and as well as getting his MA from our school, he's worked in a number of conflict zones around the world and for a number of relevant organizations, including the Pentagon, Human Rights Watch, and as a war crimes investigator at the United Nations. And he currently serves as the military advisor at PAX. And then third member of the team, we'll hear from Brittany Rosa, who will tell us about how PAX works on advocacy issues at the United Nations, including related to missions authorized by the UN Security Council. Brittany is currently PAX's UN advocacy advisor, where she works in New York. And before that, she's worked in a similar field for the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect, the NGO working group on the UN Security Council, and also in the British House of Commons. And then finally, we'll hear from our own Professor Mariam Delofra, who is our director here at the Elliott School of the Humanitarian Action Initiative. And Mariam's going to share some of her thoughts about the book and these issues based on her work. So that's our panel lineup. We'll then open up the questions from the audience. And what we'd like you to do if you have a question is if you could please submit that in the Q&A function in the chat, and I will moderate and pose those questions to the panelists in due course. So that's enough from me. Without further ado, I'd like to hand the virtual floor over to Erin.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. And of course, also a thank you to the university and to the organizers for this event. It's truly amazing. I think that remotely we can do such things, and look very much forward to engaging with all of you. So since I've already been introduced, let me just start first of all by sharing my screen. Here we go. Let me just see. So it's a small button here in front. Well, I can do it like this. Yeah, so I'm mostly here, of course, to talk about the book and specifically the topic of civilian harm. But before doing so, I would like to do just a little bit of an introduction to PAX, as I imagine that this mostly US audience will not be very familiar with our organization, which is, of course, something that absolutely needs to be changed. So PAX is a Netherlands-based peace organization or NGO. But apart from that, I think it's very important to stress that we do a lot of work in both conflict and post-conflict settings around the world. My most recent count is that we're active in 14 countries around the world, but also depending on funding, this may change a little bit. And our predominant focus areas are mostly the Middle East, sadly also because that's just an area where we see tremendous amounts of conflict. As well as Africa and specifically recently the Sahel region, but also South Sudan, Sudan, and various other countries. Now, I always find it quite difficult to explain what it is that PAX does, because it sounds very easy on the one hand to say we're working on issues of peace, but we really do so in sort of very different themes in very different areas. And I would even say in very different ways within our organization. So broadly, I'd say there's this distinction between very localized, really ground peace building work that we do. So that's, for instance, working with local communities on post-conflict communal reconciliation. For instance, if there's been a civil war in a country like Bosnia, we work with the different communities and different projects sort of to get over this whole conflict mindset again. So that's very local. At the same time, there's also a lot of work that is very much up there at the international level, really trying to sway the minds of important international actors and institutions like the UN, which Brittany will undoubtedly tell you more about, but also working directly with mostly Western militaries, for instance. And those areas are more focused on topics of humanitarian disarmament. PAX was very active in the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, for instance, but also our work, like of our team, the speakers here, which is the protection of civilians. Now, very short about what we do in our team. What we really try to do is sort of focus national and international security actors that when they do a military intervention or a peacekeeping mission, that they do so in a way that is very much focused and tailored to the needs of civilians on the ground. So less international politics and more really local needs. And this is something, unfortunately, where we still see a lot of room for improvement. But yeah, that's something we work on in different ways. We do so through advocacy, through research into the impact of conflict on civilians, research into what security needs actually are, and also to sort of relay those impressions that we get at like local or with national audiences, to relay those to international institutions. But that's, I think, enough about our team. Of course, we really want to focus on the book. I have my own copy ready. I also saw one in Mark's background. And I can definitely recommend checking it out online. As it was already said, it's fully available there. Now, what this book is about is really about sort of a very broad mapping of what it actually means for ordinary people to be living through violent conflict. Now, and I think this was already hinted at in the introduction, but what I encountered immediately when I got into this line of work and immediately started engaging, for instance, with the Dutch military, is that I found that there's this very overt focus on, okay, conflict and the impact of conflict kind of stops where it concerns civilian deaths and maybe physical injuries. Best case scenario, we might also be talking about property damage. So this very material, very immediate impact of violent conflict. And I think if you ask any kind of people who has lived through war, or even if you do more research yourself, you'll very quickly find that that is a very limited understanding of what it means to be in an active conflict zone, for instance. So what this book tries to do is that we try to broaden this understanding by including not only direct, but also indirect civilian harm effects, not only immediate, but also short and long-term harm effects, and also focus on physical and non-physical effects. Just to name two examples, I think what we often see is that psychological trauma from conflict is really very often forgotten, but it's usually one of the more pressing issues that we see in post-conflict societies. So that means children that are very affected by what they've seen and experienced in conflict. We're also, like, for instance, one of the cases in the book is about sexual and gender-based violence. The impact that it has on women and even sometimes on their children is often like tremendous, but it's also an impact that is very often forgotten. A very different example when we look at, for instance, indirect civilian harm is what happens when a bomb flattens like a city's industrial area. We are actually currently doing research into this. What then happens to the people who live there? What does that mean for economic opportunities, for loss of income? If you lose your husband and he's the family breadwinner, how will that impact the family for like the years to come? All those kinds of questions. Now, what we've done in the book, and which is, I think, a kind of a unique approach, is that we really divided it in two distinct parts. So on the one hand, we have a part where we do this very which is very evidence-based, I would say, and I imagine for students, maybe also the most interesting part of the book, where we really look into 13 separate civilian harm incidents. So 13 very concrete incidents of a particular military operation, for instance, one particular airstrike, one specific period of communal unrest. And then we look at that and really very carefully lay out. So what do we know about the people who did harm and why? What do we know about the victims? How were they harmed? How did that harm develop over time? So what can we say, for instance, about the day after the airstrike? What can we say about the year after the airstrike? What are areas of harm that still need to be discussed? What are sort of gaps in our knowledge? And then in the second part of the book, we really try to identify and distill trends and patterns from these civilian harm incidents to draw and tease out overarching conclusions, also recommendations. So that may mean, for instance, what we see in this book, something that we really try to stress is that we shouldn't only be looking at perpetrators of harm, so the people who cause harm, as people who take up weapons. It may also be, for instance, if we're looking at Yemen, what does it mean if the US military in this case actually actively provides intelligence to the people who then end up harming civilians? Is US military still responsible? Is it accountable? Those are kinds of questions that we really need to answer, and that by combining different case studies, we can sort of already start, well, maybe not answering, but at least start drawing attention to those kinds of questions. Now I'll try to sort of work towards an end, because I know Mark has a very interesting stuff to say about investigating civilian harm. What I think I really would like sort of all of you who are listening and participating to take home are really these three problems that we seek to address with this book. So the one I think I've already addressed is that we really need to move away from this focus of civilian harm as direct casualties, because if we do so, we actually neglect to take into account many other forms of harm that people actually actively experience. The second problem that I've personally run into in my work many times is that civilian harm, even though there's a multitude of organizations working on this, we actually do not really have a shared language to discuss it. So if I'm at a table with a humanitarian organization, a military actor, and for instance, say, a monitoring organization like Air Wars, all these three organizations might be talking about civilian harm, might be saying, okay, this needs to change in policy. This is kind of what we see needs to happen. And they may only find out like after an hour that they're not actually talking about the same thing. And I've actually had this happen to me. Like I've been in conversations with military officials where you keep running into, you're talking about, like you're mentioning civilian harm. What you're actually talking about is civilian casualties. And what we're talking about is something that is much broader. So like this book is also a way to try to address that problem. And then the third issue that I think particularly for NGOs is very familiar is that we still see and hear in particular this argument quite a lot, that military actors will say war and conflict, like these are such chaotic settings. It's so difficult to do research into what the impact of conflict is that we can actually not really say anything about this. This is like, sometimes this is a demonstration of lack of will, sometimes it's a demonstration of lack of capacity. But in the end, and I think a lot of New York Times articles recently have also shown that, is that there's a lot of civilian harm sort of happening also by the governments that we put our trust in, that we vote for, that we're actually not aware of. And that, of course, is a huge problem. So this book is also a way to challenge that. Like, we have these certain incidents here. Anyone may tell us it's impossible to investigate civilian harm, but here's actually something to show you the contrary. And then very shortly, I'll leave it up while I wrap up sort of this part of the presentation. So I discussed like lack of uniform language as one of the problems that we seek to tackle. So what we did with this book is that we also, based on what we found in all those case studies, tried to come up with our own definition, thinking that if we start using this and start being very explicit about using this, hopefully other actors will either take over the definition, or at least it will start a discussion on what civilian harm actually is, and really make clear where everyone stands in relation to that. So what you see up on the screen is our impression of what it should be, at least. And then very finally, of course, there's the book online that we would love for you to check out. You can visit our website as well through the same link, actually. But we also have a podcast. Mark is actually one of the co-hosts of the podcast, Civilian Protection Podcast. And that is one medium through which we sort of in a more informal way, I think, also try to get attention to many topics in relation to civilian harm and the protection of civilians. So yeah, please do check it out. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erin. Let's move seamlessly to Mark.
All right, thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen and kick this off. You know, I want to take what Erin has said and expand upon it, but really first start talking about some of her work, which is so very important. As the co-host of the Civilian Protection Podcast, I want to highlight our next episode in February is going to be talking about a single airstrike that occurred in Hawija, Iraq, that Erin has been doing an awful lot of research on. And this airstrike occurred many years ago, but it really looks at how when a bomb goes off, and in this case, 70 civilians were killed, the civilian harm doesn't end there. You know, their lack of access to hospitals, to infrastructure, to clean water, mental issues, problems with economics, with getting a job. There are a myriad number of follow-on events that occur when when a bomb explodes. And so I really think that it's going to be an amazing episode, and I would hope that some of you all would listen to it when it comes out in February, and use that as a vehicle to move into my presentation. First, what I plan to do is talk about some definitions, establish kind of a baseline for everyone, go into some best practices, then really focus in on how the US military, some of its allies, NGOs, and the UN in different ways investigate civilian harm in the field. Look at a specific case study that I investigated when I was in the UN and is actually in the book, and then end with going forward. But I want the top part to be really what the end is. And one of the important takeaways here is that the United States does not currently have a DoD-wide policy covering civilian harm and civilian casualties. This is something that has never existed. The fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act required that to occur. The Trump administration slow-rolled it. It didn't go anywhere for quite a while, but now the Biden administration has taken it up again, and it was supposed to come out just when the airstrike in Kabul happened, in which the drone sadly killed 10 family members. I'm sure all of you know about. We're now sitting back waiting for this policy to come out. The policy has been informed by an NGO consortium that works with the Pentagon. PAX was part of this consortium. And so we have been advising the US military on the future policy on civilian harm. We don't know what's going to be in it, though. And so we're all kind of sitting back quite pensively waiting for it, because as time goes forward and it continues to sit on the desk in the Pentagon, we continue to see civilian harm incidents. And so we're really waiting for it to come forward. And I would hope that all of you, when it does come out, would certainly pay attention to it. Now, on the first slide, one thing I want to highlight to folks is just the issue that we're talking about is the conduct of hostilities. You know, we're not talking about whether or not war should occur. We're talking about this is the way that war is actually conducted. And specifically for me, when I go and conduct an investigation, what's very important are the two issues of distinction and proportionality. So this is basically the rules, right? The law of armed conflict, which we call international humanitarian law, which is the Geneva Conventions. Distinction means that the military must at all times distinguish between a civilian object or a civilian and a military object or a combatant. So you have combatants and you have non-combatants, and they have to distinguish between the two. They cannot go out and attack civilians. That is unlawful. And then proportionality, that's a very difficult concept. It's a balance, right? At all times, they must balance the civilian harm that is anticipated with the military gain that is anticipated. So the civilian harm cannot be greater than the military gain. And just to give you a quick and most obvious example, if you have a sniper in a tower and he's shooting people running in the streets, the military forces can engage him. They can shoot him and kill him. They can drop a bomb on that tower that he's in and destroy it, so long as whatever incidental harm happens does not outweigh his death. But you can't nuke the city, right? You can't just destroy an entire city to take out one person. So there's a balance that has to occur. All right, let me get to the next slide here. All right, so one of the big questions we have is, well, what is a civilian? And it's kind of shocking that I've sat in meetings with the US military, and the UN and the US can't agree. You know, much like Erin pointed out, there are these definitional issues. And one big point that I'd like to make that really is part of the problem that we see, particularly in the last 20 years in US military operations, is that the United States is actually a huge outlier on international law and does not accept what pretty much most of the rest of the world's militaries does, that there's a presumption of civilian status. So that means that when in doubt, leave it out. If you don't know if the person is a military person or if they are a civilian, or, you know, are they a combatant or a non-combatant? If you don't know, you should not engage them. And the US does not exactly follow this, this basic rule. And that has been a huge issue that we continue to see in conflict. And we're hoping that the new US policy is going to address. So let's look quickly at some best practices, right? So when I'm in the field, when I'm conducting investigations, when we look to organizations that do it really well, what do you want to see? One, you want to see the research conducted in the field, right, at the actual site. Now, that's not always possible because of security issues, and there are non-permissive workarounds that organizations such as the UN and other NGOs use, but the gold standard is really field research. Now, when you're conducting the research, you know, you're looking for the number, but is the number really important, or is how and why civilians are being killed important? And so we look to find out how and why they're being killed so that you can reach your ultimate goal of improving civilian protection. And so when in the field, you're looking to pull together the forensic information. What are the bomb parts? If I take the weapon, then I can link that to a perpetrator, and that can then help me in my war crime investigations. You're conducting interviews with victims and witnesses, trying to gather as much information as possible, but you're also interviewing perpetrators. So for example, I have met with the Taliban when I was working at UNAMA in Afghanistan. I met with US military personnel and interviewed them as well. So you want to speak to all parties to the conflict. You're looking at documentation, what reports are there on it, not only media and open reports, but what kind of reports do the military have to provide you as an investigator to help back up what they're saying happened. You're working with a database, et cetera, and putting together all of the information that you have that's going to feed into a holistic report on the actual event. So, you know, you look at this picture and it looks like a big hunk of metal, right? But this is actually something that you find quite often, the engine of a tow missile, targeted optically, wire guided. And that's important to me because if I find that in the field, I know that the person who fired that actually viewed the individuals that they were shooting at. You know, they're not just a plane 30,000 feet above the clouds dropping a bomb and they can't see, but they can actually see the individual. And so that helps in a war crime investigation when you're trying to ascertain whether or not the person committed a war crime, what they knew at the time. You're looking at what kind of munitions that they used and how they employed them. And we're basically doing kind of like a CSI, right? You're going in the field, pulling this stuff out, you're doing your statistical analysis. But more and more, we're also looking at social media, the internet, crowdsourcing. I'm going to talk about air tracking crowdsourcing in the example that we go through. But just to show that there's an awful lot, and it's not just one piece of information, it's a holistic look. And let's just look real quickly at Afghanistan and how these things can help inform a military and improve civilian protection. So I went to Afghanistan in 2008. This is when the UN first began collecting statistics on civilian harm in Afghanistan. And this was also the first time that the US military and ISAF, which was the International Security and Assistance Force, which was the NATO mission there, this was the first time they began to track civilian harm. And they recognized they had a problem. And the UN, NGOs, et cetera, worked with them to implement a number of what they called tactical directives, which implemented restrictions on airstrikes. And as you can see, over time, the civilian casualties dropped. And they dropped fairly dramatically. That happened up until the NATO mission there ended. President Trump relaxed rules of engagement and removed a lot of these restrictions. And you see that airstrikes, civilian casualties from airstrikes went through the roof again. So the point I'm trying to make is that we go out and we conduct our investigations, we have our findings, we present it to a military and say, look, this is what you're doing. We would like to see changes to what's going on in the field. They can implement those changes as the US and NATO showed in Afghanistan. They can put positive changes into effect. We see civilian harm drop dramatically. But also, if they remove those restrictions, unsurprisingly, we see civilian casualties increase. So let's turn quickly and look at 3 different types of organizations and how they actually do their work. So quite famously, in 2003, General Tommy Franks kicked everything off during the war in Iraq and said, we don't do body counts. Well, things changed quite dramatically. And as you saw from the data that I put forward, they began to do body counts and do quite rigorous analytical work. And this is where we see what's called civilian harm mitigation developed. Now, civilian harm mitigation are those tactic techniques and the procedures that a military can employ to minimize harm to civilians. And those include things such as civilian harm tracking, actually figuring out, who's being killed, how many are being killed, understanding, are there problematic weapons that you're using? Are there certain areas that there are problems with? Is there a unit, for example, that has issues with civilian harm? For example, there was a fine report put out by Dr. Larry Lewis and Dr. Sarah Sewell back in 2010, which found that special operations forces were a leading cause of civilian casualties in Afghanistan. So that's this idea of civilian harm mitigation. That said, the US military has a number of problems. Hopefully they've recognized these because they are now coming out with their what we call the DoDI, the Department of Defense instruction. Some of the issues I'll go through quickly. There's really no central authority on civilian harm. You have COCOMs, which are the combatant commands. So Central Command, for example, and Africa Command, they both deal with civilian casualty issues very differently. And we really see a need for some kind of level playing field. They have an over-reliance really on classified information. We get together with them, provide them with CivCas information, and oftentimes the response is, well, we have this secret squirrel info that we can't share with you. And that proves our case. The reality is NGOs in the UN go in on the ground and do the kind of investigative work that proves that a lot of the classified information is incorrect. Now, the US used to go in on the ground and do this kind of work. They've stopped doing that. And it's unfortunate. They don't interview victims and witnesses any longer. They don't conduct on the ground investigations, even in places where they can. And quite shockingly, the US has put aside a $3 million annual fund to provide those who are harmed by US operations some kind of salacia payment or condolence payment. And none of that money was doled out last year, even though the US report showed numerous accepted civilian casualties by the US military. So we see a number of issues that we have with the US military. And here's a photo of me, quite young, when I was on a battle damage assistant mission, a bomb damage assessment mission, going in to try to look at the issues of weapon effects and civilian harm. And just to speak quickly about one particular issue, a concern that we have, or challenge, I would say, for the military, is why even bother? Why should they care about this? And sometimes it seems like they care because of the CNN effect, the worry of public blowback. But we try to present them with the issue, not only the moral need to do what's right, but also by improving your statistics, improving your targeting, you're also improving relations with the population. And then that may, in fact, then improve your own security on the ground. And so these are some of the challenges that we see occurring in a lot of the US military investigations. And this is very relatable to NATO and a number of US allies that very closely follow US policies, such as Israel, Australia, New Zealand, countries like that. So let's shift very quickly to the UN and the way they handle CivCas investigations. So the vast majority of the work at the UN is conducted by human rights officers from OHCHR, the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I've worked there for a number of years on a number of investigations and different missions. And you generally see those are the individuals conducting it. They're very well trained, they know what they're doing, but they operate in different ways depending on the mission. So if you have a blue helmeted peacekeeping mission, you're going to have one that has a protection of civilians mandate, then you can have a human rights unit conducting that kind of work. So, you look at South Sudan, for example, where in South Sudan, there are actually POC sites. And PAX has a team in South Sudan. We go to the sites and we work and try to bring together the UN and the local population so that they better understand whether or not civilians are being protected. Then you have the special political missions, such as UNAMA, where I used to work, and UNAMI in Iraq. And special political missions also rely on the human rights unit within the mission to conduct it, but you don't have the blue helmets on the ground providing, the kind of access that you may have in some of the peacekeeping missions. And so in an SPM, you're going to be relying on the local government to assist you with getting access to sites, or you're going to be relying on DSS, the Department of Security for the UN, to actually assist in that. So special political missions will do these CivCas investigations. And then finally, if you don't have a mission in a country, such as when the war in Libya was kicking off, or the war in Syria was kicking off, the Human Rights Council can create what are known as commissions of inquiry. And these are fact-finding missions, and I've been on the Libya one and the Syria one, where they will send in researchers to conduct a short-term investigation of war crimes by all parties to the conflict. Although the Syria one has been going on for like 8-10 years. So that one's been quite long. Now, the great thing about the UN work is that it's public reporting, right? So everything comes out publicly. One of the concerns that we see sometimes is that the UN goes in and liaises with a military or a government and says, hey, here are ways that you can improve civilian protection. But then the UN's blue helmeted forces may in fact be causing civilian harm. This is something, however, that the UN is beginning to address, and we're hoping to see in 2022 a real focus on that. There I am. That's actually Mazari Sharif. And just to talk about a couple of challenges that UN folks have when they're doing their work. One is ownership. You know, who owns the research and the protection of civilians portfolio? Is it the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, you know, with the blue helmeted folks? Is it the Department of Political Affairs with the special political missions? Or is it the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights, because those are the actual individuals conducting the investigations? So you have, you know, issues of rice bowls where different organizations and funding certainly come into play, and that leads to tensions. And then I just want to finish up the UN part here by talking about the host nation and concerns sometimes working with the host nation, because, you know, the UN is there at the request of the host nation, and it becomes difficult, at least I've seen in my career, it becomes difficult when you're investigating, let's say, the Taliban for their war crimes. You're going in and meeting with the US and speaking about potential war crimes there. But then when I go and I sit with locals in Afghanistan, and they say, well, what about the individuals who are currently in our government who are war criminals from our civil war? And so it becomes very difficult when you're working with a host nation where you have individuals that may be perpetrators of you know, crimes against humanity, war crimes, et cetera. So these are very difficult and sensitive political questions, to the point where the transitional justice piece in Afghanistan really didn't happen when I was there. Transitional justice being this idea that past crimes need to be dealt with as you're transitioning to a future government. And that really didn't happen because the future government had a number of war criminals in it. So now let's just switch over to NGOs and look at how they do it. You know, organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they have highly skilled and well-trained crisis teams that go out and very rapidly flow to a conflict as it happens. They do on-site investigations and really are the gold standard for how this kind of work occurs. There is sometimes criticism where they're called war tourists. You know, you show up, I fly into a country, I conduct my investigation, I leave, never to be seen again. I think it's important for us to understand that NGOs need to have a sustained effort of advocacy in those countries to try to continue to help the individuals who have been harmed in conflict. And that does occur. Sometimes it becomes very difficult for the local population to see that, but it is certainly a large part of the effort that NGOs conduct. And I just want to touch one part here, do no harm, you know, interview fatigue. I can't tell you how many times I go in and I speak to people and it's like, well, I've already spoken to you. No, oh, you spoke to the UN, or no, you spoke to Human Rights Watch, or no, you spoke to this one. And people are being bombarded in reporters. And so, you know, there's this constant fatigue, and that's a huge issue. So let's look very quickly at a case study. So in Khan Sheikhoun, April 4th, 2017, there were reports of numerous civilians killed, a total of 83 with 293 injuries. This became quite a political issue because the UN and others came out very forcefully saying that this was a case of Syria using chemical weapons against their own population. It became politicized because President Trump then responded with a kinetic attack against an airfield, empty airfield, but an airfield nonetheless in Syria. And I just want to walk quickly through some of the things that we did in our investigation. So one, we were looking at, you know, a lot of evidence. There's physical evidence. You have the deaths, the injured. You know, those are clear pieces of physical evidence. There are bodies. You have the impact site, the debris of the weapons that I'm going to go over next, the remains of the chemical that were analyzed by scientists from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. We had electronic intercepts of pilots flying to the area. There's an interesting thing that the Syrian population have done. They've created this early warning system in which former Syrian Air Force personnel hide out outside of Russian and Syrian airfields. and they will track the launching of aircraft, noting the weaponry on board if they can, and they will call forward to the cities that are in the direction that that flight is headed so that people can take shelter. And as the plane overflies that city, they will then tell the next city. And this is a way that you're seeing that people are protecting themselves in the conflict. And we're able to take those tweets and show a timeline of how the planes are actually flying. And of course, we also speak to victims and witnesses. Now, one of the best pieces of evidence that you've got is the physical evidence. And here we have a very shallow impact crater. It's not like a huge bomb crater, 20 meters deep. This is a very shallow crater, which is very typical of a chemical weapon because it only has a small charge to open up the actual case. So this really is kinetic energy. Also, pretty much every bomb that's ever been made is color coded, which is super helpful. So 2 green stripes means it's chemical weapons. This one, we got 2 green stripes on it. We're also able to get the filler cap, get close measurements on that, and tie it to a specific type of Russian chemical weapon bomb that they've sold to the Syrians. And so we had a lot of really solid physical evidence. But we also had an individual from OPCW conduct an analysis for us. And you'll see there's a red tip there. That's where the bomb impacted. Now, looking at, he did not only an atmospheric analysis, but also a geographical analysis. The ground is sloping down from where that red point is down to the edge. And sarin, which was the chemical used, is heavier than air. And the way that the wind was blowing, he showed that this would be the most likely area that we would find casualties. And it was, in fact, where we found civilian casualties. Unfortunately, as the early warning system got to those individuals, they hid in their basements. And with the sarin being heavier than air, that ended up killing them. So this is an example of an investigation. And so what, right? So what is the accountability? So when we look to accountability mechanisms, first, we're looking to militaries to police themselves. So the US, for example, has the Universal Code of Military Justice. We look to the Security Council to put out things such as, International Criminal Court. But that can be highly problematic because one, either it doesn't happen, or when it does, as we've seen right now in the Afghanistan case, the ICC has said they're not going to look at US military operations. So highly problematic. Then the Human Rights Council can stand up and say, hey, listen, Security Council, you're not doing your job. We're going to send in a fact-finding mission with Mark Arlasco. Hi, here I go. I do my job. The General Assembly also has a method they can put together, such as the international, impartial, and independent mechanism that they have on Syria right now, taking information from the Human Rights Council and also their own work. And then finally, if all of the accountability mechanisms fail, you have, as we've recently seen, Germany using universal jurisdiction goes in and says, hey, we have Syrians in our country that are potential war criminals. We're going to have a trial. And that's what we see going on right now. I want to finish with just going forward. We see a growing and continuing trend of relations between NGOs and the UN with militaries on civilian harm issue. For example, the African Union has been incredibly forward-leaning on their work in Somalia, taking on civilian harm mitigation and putting that into place. And we've seen a huge shift in civilian harm from African Union forces because of that. So very positive. We see things going forward, such as Erin's work with the Dutch on the Hawija strike. We see individual countries conducting investigations when their militaries fail to, such as in Australia with the Brereton report, where they looked at war crimes conducted by their own forces, and also New Zealand did the same. NATO is now more and more focusing on it, and they've put out a phenomenal handbook on civilian harm that I highly recommend folks look at. And finally, what I led off with is the US military is going to be putting out their first ever policy, and that has huge implications. And so here's my contact info. I welcome students to send me an email, follow me on Twitter, and please check out the Civilian Protection Podcast. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for a fascinating tour of the horizon and Crater's views of the process. And now we can move, obviously, I guess, to the next logical part of the process, which is the advocacy that's done afterwards. So, Brittany, over to you.
Thanks so much. I think I have maybe the benefit or the disadvantage of going after both of my expert colleagues, because they've covered some of the points that I'm intending to cover already, but that means that you just have to hear less of my voice, which is also probably a good thing. Let me just figure out here how to share my screen really quickly and hope it works. Can everyone see everything okay? Perfect. Okay, so I'll start, I guess, by introducing myself a little bit. You've heard a little bit from my bio already, but I think it's also interesting to discuss maybe how I fit in New York, as opposed to, for example, my colleagues Mark and Aaron. As Aaron mentioned, I am also a member of the POC team with Impacts, but as the advocacy staffer, I'm also sort of a broader, I have a broader focus than some of my other colleagues who focus more on specific content issues. So I engage directly with the UN. That is my area of remit, let's say. But I also am in the public affairs team. I also work on various other issues that Aaron mentioned that PAX works on overall. So my role specifically is to translate the research and content expertise of my colleagues and our partners that are really experts in their areas into actionable policy recommendations and advocacy strategies, specifically at the UN. We've heard from Aaron and Mark a bit on civilian harm, also specifically on civilian harm mitigation. Thanks for making the introductions to that, Mark. And we've heard of that from more of through PAX's research lens, as well as through experiences working directly with various military and civilian institutions, assessing impacts. But I would like to walk through, of course, the main advocacy aims today, specifically targeting the international community, but even more specifically, the UN as the highest level and most wide-reaching international organization. I'll do so through first exploring PAX's individual advocacy methods, as well as providing an overview of UN infrastructure. Mark touched on some of the issues already, but I might dive a little bit deeper into jurisdictional issues. And then I'll also assess the current status of civilian harm, specifically civilian harm mitigation and the protection of civilians, or POC, within the UN system, and then make some sort of broad recommendations for UN policymakers. Maybe as you derived from the other presentations, our overarching advocacy goal with this work, with this specific book as well, is more to broaden the international community's understanding and definition of civilian harm from armed conflicts, to improve prevention, mitigation, and response efforts, and also to ensure that protection of civilians is not just from direct harm, but also indirect harm, short, medium, and long-term impacts, of course, as well. And that will be our main approach towards the UN system. Sorry, for some reason, there we go. So first, PAX as an international peace organization. Aaron touched on this a little bit, so I will maybe skip through some of the points, but mostly noting that as an international peace organization, we have a sort of unique profile within the NGO sphere of focusing on peace, which means we work on all facets of peace, including sort of bridging both the peace building and peace and security spheres, as well as human rights, development, justice, whatever it really takes to achieve peace. But all of our advocacy goals, all of our peace building work, human rights work, justice work, et cetera, is all through the lens of focusing on how to promote the protection of civilians in armed conflict and really improve human security. My main priority issues within the PAX UN office are both thematic and country specific. And we've decided sort of how I will work within the New York sphere based on what we've deemed areas within PAX's work where we can have the most impact within the UN space. This, for me, means at the moment working on, as I said, thematic issues. So for example, on gender, peace, and security, on environment and climate security issues, as well as the protection of civilians, as well as working specifically on country case situations, for example, working right now on Syria, and even more specifically working on, for example, housing, land, and property rights, which sort of bridges the human rights, justice, development, overarching peace architecture. Our advocacy basis is twofold. You've already heard quite a lot from the research side. and we get content from issue area experts such as Aaron, Mark, many others. I think some of our colleagues at the Stimson Center are also on this call, so I'd like to shout out to them as well as working with various academic institutions, and of course, specifically with partners and our PACS offices on the ground within conflict situations. So Mark, as I mentioned, touched on the jurisdictional issues a bit within the UN system. I don't know if you can see here the organogram of the UN system itself. It's quite complex. So are all of the jurisdictional and mandate issues that the UN system faces. And it's really important when addressing advocacy at the UN to know when you're asking policymakers to do something, that they can actually do what you're asking them to do according to international law, according to mandates, according to resources, etc. This is really important also at the UN when looking at the UN system. Of course, within this very complex system of varying agencies with varying mandates, varying staff and resourcing, there are a number of challenges which have impacts on implementation, even of the most well-meaning policies, for example, preventing civilian harm, protecting civilians. And many of these are, as you can see, even from the organogram itself, silos. So it's very difficult within these bodies to share information. It affects resource pooling, and also within differences in terminology. When working at the field level, maybe you'll have the same actors who are implementing peace building mandates. They'll be implementing human rights activities, various training that touches on various aspects of international law. There are different bodies that deal with each of these definition mandates, issue areas, and they're all separate within the HQ, the headquarters, and the maybe upper echelons of decision making, which can make it quite difficult, especially within these differences in terminology. If you're discussing one thing and thinking it's called two different things, for example. However, the protection of civilians, as I mentioned, is a UN system-wide policy and mandate, and civilian harm mitigation is a vital part of any protection of civilians policy. Of course, the systemic disconnect within the UN also has implications on system-wide policies like on POC and civilian harm mitigation, which you may hear me call CHM intermittently. This means that discussions and advocacy on civilian harm are also need to be targeted at a variety of actors, sometimes with differing asks. Mark also mentioned, right, that there's DPO, so the Department of Peace Operations, DPPA, Peace Building and Political, OCHA, Humanitarian, OHCHR, Human Rights, the Secretary General, overarching, Security Council, Peace and Security, many different UN bodies and agencies. And all of them have different components also between the headquarters level as well as the field level and the levels in between. And they all have a hand and a responsibility to implement aspects of civilian harm mitigation. These responsibilities and jurisdictions very often vary based on mandates, as I mentioned. And all of them have sort of a more generic global mandate, which looks at helping member states with their peace building, political, human rights capacities, as well as then the mission specific mandates. So agency and mission specific mandates looking at where UN missions sort of geographically have mandates to operate, as well as looking at specific language on what they can explicitly do and what they cannot do maybe falls within some sort of translation or understanding of that. This means, of course, that civilian harm mandating can vary across even the agencies at HQ level, even if it's, or missions, even if they're housed within the same UN agency. There have been steps taken within the UN system to remedy this, to remedy the disconnect, I guess, between the various initiatives and policies, all based on POC and civilian harm mitigation. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's many, which also has its own concerns, but I want to look specifically at the POC policy of the UN, which Mark mentioned a bit, which is aimed specifically at dealing with civilian harm from UN operations, for example, from peace operations like MINUSMA or UNMISS. And this helps missions to outline guidelines for the identification of risks of civilian harm, planning to mitigate these risks, as well as how to track impacts in order to sort of inform future mitigation planning. And this sort of bridges the military and civilian components, which are both relevant for civilian harm mitigation and are both necessary. Then there's the Hrddp, the Human Rights and Due Diligence Policy. This is a UN system-wide policy. It's an internal due diligence policy aimed at informing UN support of non-UN security forces. This is except, for example, AMISOM, the assistance mission in Somalia, and it provides guidance for risk assessments, for example, of the likelihood of violations of human rights and civilian harm, as well as means of implementing ways to mitigate the risks of these harms. It also can include policies which must be taken up by the non-security forces in order to receive UN support. Then finally, some recommendations more thoroughly here, but of course I have to start with, it's the primary responsibility of all parties to the conflict to take the steps to prevent civilian harm from the very start, of course. But our main recommendation, as mentioned, is really to look at the UN and international community's understanding and definition and urge them to broaden it to include, of course, direct and indirect harm, short and long-term, physical and non-physical, as well as individual and collective harm, and take measures to mitigate that. As well as this should also helpfully lead to some more coherence and uniformity in language to help deal with some of that disconnect within the UN system, help deal with the implementation which moves across UN missions and agencies. Also, there are good practices that we can learn from at the national level, and also maybe some bad practices to learn from as well that the UN and other member states can learn from. The UN Security Council should really more explicitly support civilian harm language through concrete inclusion in mission mandates. This can also help with resourcing needs. Importantly, also the UN should strengthen accountability and civilian harm evaluation measures. Mark touched on this a bit as well, through systematic evaluation, safe collection of evidence, etc. But most importantly, I think from an NGO perspective, civilians, civil society, and affected communities must be included in the development of all prevention, mitigation, and response strategies. Okay, I'll stop there. Here's my contact information as well. And I hope that I stayed somewhere near time. Sorry about that. Thanks.
No, all good, Brittany. Thank you very much for giving us the sort of New York eye view then on what's got to happen next once you've got this information. And now finally turn over to our own Mariam Delofra, who will give us her reflections on these issues. Mariam, over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. So I really enjoyed reading this research by PAX and appreciate the opportunity to chime in. And I'm going to take an even bigger bird's eye view than Brittany just did and try to put this discussion of harm into relationship with the humanitarian sector, which is my area of expertise. Humanitarian action, the imperative to relieve human suffering wherever it may occur, has a long intertwined relationship to violence, conflict, and military action. Henry Dunant, the founder of the ICRC, Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, and Eglantine Jebb, the founder of the Save the Children, all acted on this humanitarian imperative to relieve the suffering they witnessed during war. Conflict remains the key driver of humanitarian need. Dozens of highly violent conflicts are killing and maiming a record number of children, forcing them to flee their homes and putting their lives on hold. Conflict, violence, and extremism has contributed to widespread hunger, displacement, and death in places like Afghanistan, Yemen, and Syria. Today, the relationship between humanitarians and combatants is even more complex. Military actors such as NATO in Kosovo or the American coalition in Afghanistan wage humanitarian interventions to protect human rights, but also contribute to human suffering. Military and defense forces are not only perpetrators of harm, but providers of humanitarian assistance via reconstruction teams in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, or medical teams responding to the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. This blurring of lines is said to also put humanitarian actors in positions of insecurity by compromising their perceived neutrality and making them targets of harm. Among other factors, this blurring of lines between military and humanitarian actors fostered a reckoning in the humanitarian field regarding the effects and impacts of humanitarian action. It led to discussions about intentions and harm, and to the eventual adoption of the do no harm norm, which informs standard setting, risk management, and programming to this day. The realization that their well-intended actions caused harm was shocking because it is the antithesis of what they are meant to do: help, not harm. The idea of do no harm has a long history, articulated as a core tenet of the Hippocratic Oath. It is now ubiquitous in the field of humanitarian action. Since Mary Anderson's groundbreaking work in 1999, do no harm is now seen as a fundamental organizing principle of humanitarian action. Do no harm shifts focus from the intentions of humanitarian action to its consequences. Harm itself is a socially constructed category, and thus, in order to understand harm, we need to both refine definitions of harm, its substance, and place the concept of harm within the actions and interactions that produce it. The book on civilian harm helps advance our understanding of harm by examining these dimensions. It asks seemingly simple questions such as, what is harm? Is it universally understood? Or is it fluid, context dependent, and dynamic? What is the range of harm? The book complicates our notions and definitions of harm from one discrete isolated event to considering spillover and connected effects that reverberate within communities and across time. Another important contribution is defining harm as a relational concept committed against vulnerable populations by someone. Harm doesn't just happen on its own. An actor or action causes harm. The discussion and typologies of perpetrators and victims is both a strength and a weakness of the book. Often we talk about harm as tied to conventional metrics of civilian casualties, of sexual assaults and abuse, of destruction of access to survival goods. And as the book argues, these metrics are not enough because they do not capture the complex relationships that cause harm and through which harm reverberates, lingers, and persists. Can we separate harm from those who cause harm? Who is responsible for preventing harm? Who is accountable? These are empirical questions, questions of metrics and measurement, but they are also political questions. Assigning blame or responsibility, demanding or ensuring accountability involve political interests and power. The book could go further in considering these political questions of power and interests. It assumes that we want to avoid, minimize, and respond to civilian harm with better data, but it is not entirely clear that this is a universal interest. Certainly in the cases of Khan Shaykhun in Syria, in Ukraine and Myanmar, which the book highlights, this was not the case. States deliberately and brutally targeted civilians. The more difficult question then becomes, how do we generate support for a do no harm norm as humanitarians have done in their sector? In the humanitarian field in the 1990s, there was a general consensus that humanitarians should not cause harm. A decades-long process followed to coordinate actors around what obligations of humanitarians are to do no harm and how to hold humanitarian actors to account. These efforts have generated norms and standards for the sector, largely because the underlying logic of the field is collaborative in that humanitarians in general are collectively working to reduce human suffering. The underlying logic of the security field is more competitive with competing national or group interests. The book mentions international humanitarian law, standard setting efforts, and codes of conduct as one way to promote and generate support for do no harm. These are certainly potential mechanisms, but then the classic problem of who will hold whom to account and how become the primary conundrums. I wonder as well whether do no harm can coexist within traditional national security paradigms, or whether we need a more fundamental shift in mindset to notions of human security that center consideration of vulnerable people and a shared humanity rather than national interests. No book can do everything, and this book already makes great strides in advancing our understanding of harm, its many dimensions and manifestations, and will enrich policy discussions for years to come. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Mariam, for those thoughtful reflections. I would just pile in and reiterate, yeah, particularly for the students in the audience, the case study material is very interesting in the book to give you a real insight into the dynamics, both, as you said, Mariam, empirical, but also political. What I would like to do is just invite briefly anyone on the PAX team to respond to anything Mariam has said there. And then we've got a few questions that I can pose from the audience. And if anyone else in the audience needs reminding, if you want to pose a question, just put them in the chat there and I'll shepherd them to the panel. So Mark, over to you.
Yeah, just a quick comment on, picking up on what Mariam said. And I think noting importantly the language that we use. I sit here and talk about harm incidental to military operations. Militaries use the term collateral damage, which I absolutely hate, is the most awful term that you could think. And because of the law and the need for us to talk about these things in relation to international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, we often can seem very callous and cold. And I think it's important for us to recognize that these are human beings that are being harmed, that are being killed. And, there is the law and there is the way that we move forward, but there's got to be a human side to it. And so always to just keep that in mind. And that's why the way that Erin put the book together, with those case studies and looking at how individuals were affected, I think it's so important for us to get beyond that, the very sterile language that we use sometimes. Thanks.
Thank you. What I've got here is a bunch of questions. I'd like to pose one, I think, to probably Erin first, and then a couple to Mark on the United States. Erin, there's a question coming here thinking about the context between Russia and Ukraine at the moment, and what sort of preemptive steps might organizations like yourself be able to take to sort of think about civilian harm mitigation strategies and reporting, sort of in the event that a new war occurs or the old one intensifies again in Ukraine. So start off with you there.
Yeah, that's actually a very fascinating question. I think also a very difficult question to kick it off. At PAX, actually, we're watching the Ukraine situation quite closely, both because we do a lot of work with NATO, but also because we actually do work in Ukraine itself. So those are also like partner organizations that we're now directly concerned about. So it's really worrying what we see there. I think one way in which sort of this book already maybe shows some relevance in particular, in relation particular to that context, is this question of, will there actually be like a military intervention, or, as some analysts seem to suggest, are we much more looking at like cybersecurity and sort of cyber destabilization? And I think that's a topic that we actually didn't address in the book, but one that we sort of were grappling with, like, should we include it? If so, can we? How do we go about this? In the end, we decided not to, because I think we could have written like a 5-volume piece on it if we kept sort of adding these kind of themes and topics to it. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, first of all, if we're not sure there's going to be a military intervention, Russia or even other actors may still be taking steps that actually destabilize communities and that still cause civilian harm one way or another. And I think in that sense, it's good to sort of broaden our understanding of civilian harm to not only just look at casualties in that sense. Let me see if there's more we can say on this particular topic. I mean, obviously, we're very concerned about what happens. I think, speaking for PAX, say in the event that NATO would respond to any kind of military aggression, we now know that they actually have a protection of civilian handbook. We now know that they have a military guidance. And I think for an NGO like ours, it would be very, I don't want to say interesting, because obviously we do not want this situation to unfold, but it would be informative in a way to see whether, policy and kind of recommendations that we've bringing to the fore, whether they're actually translating into practice. Because it's one thing to have like a beautiful POC policy, like protection of civilians policy in place. It's another to actually then live up to that kind of standard. So I think those would be things that we as an NGO would be looking at. But yeah, very interesting question.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, you're sort of making even more work for yourselves by expanding the concept of civilian harm. But I think, obviously, for me at least, empirically, it's absolutely realistic and necessary to think of it in those multidimensional longer terms. But you're right, it increases the agenda and the type of expertise needed. I've got a couple of questions for Mark next, and then I'm going to pose one to the whole panel. On Mark, specifically on what the United States has been doing here. Start with the more sort of pointed question, let's say, about, you know, to what degree can we actually trust the sort of the information that's been coming out of DoD specifically in well, not just recent years, but for quite a long time, as you've said here. And what is your sense about the relative levels of transparency that we've seen coming out from DoD on these issues, and what steps, if any, do you think the United States government has been taking that has actually mitigated some of this stuff and helped them be a more credible voice on these issues, when there's obviously a lot of criticism and skepticism about what the United States has been doing and saying about these strikes and other activities?
Well, you know, there are and should be huge trust issues with the U.S. military. I mean, I look specifically at the recent strike in Yemen by Saudi aircraft, Saudi and UAE aircraft, and you know, if you look at my Twitter account, well, one of my friends who's a journalist posted an image of a piece of a bomb that came out of that site, and we were able to link it not only the type of bomb but also to the manufacturer, to Raytheon here in the United States. So not only the US's actions itself are problematic, but also the support that it gives to different countries that are, you know, conducting operations that end up leading to civilian harm. So I think there are huge trust issues, problems with lack of transparency. I'll also say that there seems to be, you know, things kind of move back and forth, where you have times where they focus very much on it and policies are quite good, to times when the focus just isn't there and those policies are not quite as good. And, you know, there are a number of studies that the US military has, you know, that it's on its own has conducted over the last years, and they are not even implementing their own recommendations. So certainly there are great concerns that we have. But, you know, I look at the new DoD instruction coming out, and on the plus side, you know, they asked us for help, right? They said, what do you think we can do better? And if you want to go to interaction.org, your students can go there and see there's we've written up all the consortium of NGOs, and not only have we been meeting with DoD, but we put together the points that we think that they should take. So you can look at those precisely. But I just want to raise five things that I think are important to come out of this policy. One, there needs to be leadership. You know, things come from the top. And so there has to be some kind of a unified authority that's properly resourced with personnel that can conduct these kind of investigations and conduct this work. And so you have leadership on civilian harm. So it comes from the top saying that, you know, civilian casualties and the greater issue of civilian harm is something that we're responsible for. So that's one. The second, I mean, legally, we have to change this idea in the US that we don't have a presumption of civilian status. It's just such a driving factor in why so many people are killed in US strikes. Third, it just has to be a whole complete change on how investigations are conducted by the US military and other actors. You know, we need to see them completely rework it from potentially going on the ground, but certainly, you know, speaking to victims and witnesses, bringing in NGO and UN information, third-party information. These are really important things to go to do. Response. It's time to stop the denial and blame game. The response shouldn't be that we had a righteous strike and then we find out that, you know, 10 civilians were killed and the target was actually not even what they thought it was. So stop with those kind of responses. Instead, respond with an investigation, amends when appropriate, and deal with the problem. Then finally, and possibly most importantly, is accountability. One of the reasons that we see so many instances of civilian harm is because there really is no sense of accountability. There's no sense that anything is going to happen. And, you know, accountability is a spectrum, right? It doesn't just mean that you're throwing everybody into prison or having a war crimes tribunal. Accountability is everything from lessons learned and improving your policies and procedures, through more systemic changes in the way things occur, to finally, if people are guilty of violating the law, then putting them on, then holding them to account for that. But those are the main points I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, that was a very helpful answer. I think you've actually covered both of the questions we had on that aspect, both the transparency and then what we would like to see in the new DoDI here. Certainly resonates with some of my own work on Somalia, where I just think a couple of issues that you've said stood out to me was, number one, when Amnesty International did what I thought was a very thorough investigation of US airstrikes in the Lower Shabelle region of Somalia a number of years back, and really honed in on about half a dozen strikes where their on the ground investigations really didn't match up with what AFRICOM and others have been reporting. And eventually DOD and AFRICOM didn't go the whole way of agreeing with the entire Amnesty report, but on a couple of those strikes, they did reverse their interpretation of what happened and actually admit to civilian casualties where none had been admitted originally. And so I see that as a very good example of actual, the advocacy and investigation and the power of it at work. And secondly, on accountability, you may have seen just last year, there was a number of Ugandan soldiers in Amisom that killed nearly seven civilians in a particularly violent and deliberate incident when they thought they'd been attacked. But these UPDF soldiers were put through a court-martial in Somalia, and two of them were actually sentenced to death just recently as a result of this. So I hear loud and clear what you say about accountability being a spectrum, and we've now got an example there in Amisom, where accountability has actually been sentencing to death a couple of peacekeepers for committing these crimes against civilians, which I would argue is actually a higher standard than a lot of the own Somali National Army has had, which has also perpetrated a lot of violence here. My question to the rest of the panel, I suppose particularly Mariam and Brittany as well here, is about disinformation and what role sort of this adds into the mix. I'd just be curious from Pax's perspective and from Mariam's perspective more broadly, how much of a problem of sort of concerted disinformation campaigns, either about particular strikes, whether it's the chemical weapons or not in Syria, or more broadly, the sort of muddying and confusing of the waters about what goes on in these areas. How much of a problem do you see that is for Pax specifically, and then more generally? I don't know who wants to go first, probably Brittany or Erin.
I can jump in quickly just because I don't have an answer for you. So, but it's interesting that you raised that question, because it was one of the notes that I took as I was reading the cases. So just from what I can remember, in the discussion of the bombing on the hospital in Ukraine, and then the discussion of the Myanmar case, in both those situations, you actually had a use of misinformation and social media implicated. And so for me, as I was thinking about, thinking about harm and the perpetrators of harm, and again, I recognize that this book can't do everything, but I was thinking, well, what about these peripheral kind of actors, such as Facebook and Twitter, these social media companies? In the case of Ukraine, it was state-sponsored, right, disinformation, but that are causing harm, not in traditional ways that we would think about at all, in more of these digital ways, but not directly, right? So they're more the mechanisms or the tools. So how do we think about them in these scenarios? They could stop it, right? They could stop these campaigns, they could shut it down, but they don't. And that notion of responsibility then again becomes even more diffuse. And it was even more weighing on my mind, because I'm sure that you all saw that this weekend, the ICRC had a huge hack of their data. And so the discussion of digital harm in the humanitarian sector is a really big question, because we're using more and more big data to make humanitarian assistance more efficient, but then that comes with risks, right? So what happens if the data gets into the wrong hands, which is precisely what happened at the end of last week and this weekend with the ICRC. And so again, sort of thinking about expanding these notions of harm, expanding, how harm is waged, but also the kind of what risks are we actually mitigating, and by whom? So I don't have any answers for you, but I actually had the same question. So I'm going to just punt it to to Brittany and Aaron.
That's great. Thanks, Mariam.
Maybe I'll jump in quickly as well, simply because I think Aaron's actually better positioned to answer this, but I do want to bridge off of what Miriam was saying in terms of sort of what other actors are responsible. And I think it's not just these private institutions. There's also different disinformation campaigns that are utilized as official policies at the UN. So it really is important to definitely be gathering this evidence, ensuring that there are sort of international independent mechanisms, like, for example, the IIIM in Syria and in Myanmar, that are helping to facilitate this. But there's also, of course, as Miriam mentioned, those concerns around safe collection of that evidence and information, and protecting human rights defenders and communities who are helping to assist and facilitate and provide that information as well. So yeah, would definitely be interested in hearing more from a broad array of actors on the risks involved, but also and how they impact various aspects of the international community, and also ways that we can help to prevent or protect within the cybersecurity space as well. Aaron.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Aaron.
Yeah, I think it's actually wonderful that you bring this question in, and also that you bring an example of Myanmar. So maybe just as a bit of context so that I can also better explain what I then mean. I think so in Myanmar, we saw this campaign of ethnic cleansing, where it was really the state military that violently persecuted a Muslim minority living within its territory, but which it had really branded sort of as, this is a minority that isn't actually a minority in the sense that it isn't part of our national population. These are actually people from a neighboring country who are here illegally. And sort of on that pretext, there was a lot of disinformation, a lot of hate campaigns, which we also saw taking place largely online, which can definitely be argued to, if not caused, at least heavily contributed to sort of the hostility there was towards this minority, and also towards the violence that we in the end then saw. Now I should add, I think that this isn't a topic that PAX typically works on. So I'm also sort of in the danger of speaking maybe more on what I would like to see necessarily than sort of what my organization stands for, simply because this isn't a topic that we have conducted much work on so far. But I think if I would relate this Myanmar example to the book, I think what we see here is almost some kind of fringe responsibility when it comes to companies like Facebook, or probably also other companies, but I know Facebook was very notorious when it came to Myanmar. Also in a way that I think in the book, we've really focused very much on state and non-state actors, but at least like these kind of armed actors. And like the example that I raised earlier about Yemen was like, we can have maybe a Saudi coalition doing the actual killing of people and actual harming of civilians. But if it happens with US intelligence, then there is definitely some kind of enabling of that harm taking place. And I think with companies like Facebook, we kind of see the same, because they have a huge outreach. I think in Myanmar was something like 70% of the population at the time was using Facebook, or was even using it sort of as the main source of information, which then of course gives these companies a huge responsibility as they have this huge reach. I think the most important thing, because I personally, these are really personal convictions, I don't really believe in, I think, private companies regulating themselves. So I do again very much see an opportunity, and also a very strong need for the international community, for governments, for governmental institutions, to actually design policies around this. I think Myanmar should have been a wake-up call, and I know to some extent it was. I mean, it did really create discussions about the role of Facebook. I think what happened in the US itself with the attack on the US Congress kind of did the same. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg has actually been in situations where he had to answer for what Facebook contributed to. But I think it's really important that we take these opportunities to also see them. Yes, they are perpetrators of harm in a sense, maybe not the most obvious sense. And that also means that something should happen to sort of regulate that in a way. But that is going a little bit off topic, I think, for us, but that's what I would say.
Thank you. More broader category still. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment from a war crime investigator perspective. Last year, there was an incident where YouTube started to take down a lot of what they considered to be graphic content. And they were really erasing some information that war crime investigators were relying on, because that a lot of conflicts, you know, people walk around with smartphones and they immediately post things to YouTube or Twitter or whatnot. And while that doesn't have the evidentiary level where you can bring that to a tribunal, that is certainly something that war crime investigators use as a first blush to, you know, something that, okay, we need to put on our radar screen as something that we need to investigate. And when they started taking that down, there was really an outcry, and there were a number of articles. There was an organization called Bellingcat, which is one of the most reputable open source investigators out there. And, you know, it really cut into a lot of organizations' abilities to conduct the kind of research that they normally do.
Thank you. Yeah, I said you're expanding your own agenda here, I think, in important ways, but it's going to make for a depressing analysis. Frighteningly, we've nearly reached the end of our time. We've just got a couple of minutes here. And so just, I suppose, a very quick last question, building on the one that's been popped in the chat about automation. And it got to my final question. I suppose this was mainly for Mark as well, with the US military in context, is about, you know, how much of this can be fixed by better training and education of soldiers, and, you know, maybe different types of munitions. And as John's question there in the chat mentions, you know, is there a role for, as we're going to see more of, you know, more AI enabled and enhanced targeting systems to actually improve maybe some of the human errors, or is this a sort of red herring? And it's really about the political policy and leadership changes that we need to see that will drive the accountability. So just some quick final thoughts there, and then we'll wrap up.
Wow. Okay. Super easy in like 2 minutes. So from my perspective, one, I don't want to ever see a world in which a computer is making life or death decisions on targeting using lethal weapons. So plain and simple. Can data assist? Yes, absolutely. I was on the USS Theodore Roosevelt in 2015, conducting or assisting in a research project looking at airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. And you would be shocked when airplanes land, you know, they have this little box, this data module that they take out, they plug in, and all the data is downloaded, and so that can be used. Well, you'd be shocked how many times that just doesn't happen. So can small incremental things be done to improve data? Absolutely. Can work be done to improve investigations and targeting? Sure. But I think we really need to have strong leadership pushing forward policies that severely limit the application of lethal force. And that's one of the best ways to enhance civilian protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thanks very much to all our panelists on our behalf. You know, shame we were in the virtual world and not meeting in person. And thank you to our audience for the questions. I'm still on the fence. I'm not sure whether you've cheered me up or depressed me further about these sets of issues, but I really appreciate, as I said, that what I think is a realistically large and sort of multidimensional agenda that we have to tackle here. And I hope particularly for the students in the audience as well, that you can see there's important professional jobs and work to be had in this area. So it's not just a matter of studying it, but as I think the book makes very clear, if we can't study and understand, you know, what really happens in warfare, then we haven't got much hope of resolving the civilian harm problems we face. So there's lots more still to be done. Thanks very much finally to our panel again, and we'll wrap it up there with our recording. So thanks very much to everybody for their time and contributions.